Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? I kind of know where we came from. We came from chaos, right? All things were just empty and formless, and the surface of God hovered over the waters or something. I don't know. We'll get to that in this conversation. I'm very excited to talk to our guest today. As you may know, there was a little teaser in there. If you can guess who it was, good for you. We have no other host today. It's just me, Richard Littauer, joining you live from Vermont. It's good to be here. It's way too hot. And I'm joined today by not one, nor two, but three separate guests. Lots of voices, lots of fun. We are joined by Dawn Foster. Dawn, say hi. How you doing?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
And Elizabeth Barron. Elizabeth, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you for coming. And Luis Cañas-Diaz. Luis, how are you?
I'm fine. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
And I'm really happy to have you too. All three of you have never met before, and this is celebrity. No, actually, you've all been working together for years, I think, at the CHAOSS Project. The CHAOSS community, if you don't know about it, is an awesome community that focuses on metrics for open source. We've had many members of CHAOSS, including me, I guess, because I sometimes go to CHAOSS meetings, on this podcast before. And in fact, Sustain, I believe, used to or still sponsors in some way. We run the Fireside podcast for the CHAOSS podcast itself, which is also very fun. So it's good to have some co-hosts on today. Dawn and Elizabeth, welcome. And today we're talking specifically about practitioner guides. Now, why these three people? That is a good question. Dawn, I think we covered this before, but you know it better than I do. How are you three connected to the CHAOSS project?
I am the director of data science for the CHAOSS project. Elizabeth Barron is the CHAOSS community manager. Luis is a co-founder of Bitergia, and he's been involved in the tools that became the CHAOSS project since, I think, the very beginning. So all three of us have worked quite a bit within the CHAOSS project, and the three of us have also collaborated on the CHAOSS Practitioner Guides.
Very exciting. Okay, so before we get to the practitioner guides, which are really, really cool, for people who don't know about CHAOSS project, you do focus on metrics. We mentioned that. Great. What does that mean? What kind of working groups are there? Why metrics? And how many people are in the projects? Can you give me a basic general overview of those sorts of questions?
I feel like that was a softball too. Thank you. I appreciate that. So we have about 2,000 people in our Slack right now. They come from all over the world. We have regional chapters in Africa, Latin America, Balkans, Asia. And then, of course, what I call the usual suspects, which, North America, Europe. So CHAOSS cares a lot about open source community health. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what that means, how we define it, how we can track and measure it, and how we can help others improve the open source communities that they run or the projects that they're running. But obviously, like your human body, there's a lot of different ways to define health and to look at that. So we have different working groups that look at it from different lenses. So one of our working groups, for instance, is corporate OSPOs. So those folks care about a specific set of things that they are trying to achieve in their open source projects. We also have science and research open source groups that focus specifically on those kinds of projects. And their needs are a lot different than somebody working in a corporate OSPO. And then we also have a university OSPOs. And again, they have a specific set of needs and goals that they're trying to achieve from their points of view. And then we also have some more, I call them operational groups within CHAOSS, such as like our diversity, equity, inclusion working group, our metrics development working group, metrics models, all kinds of stuff going on at CHAOSS. So that's a high level, 30-second, maybe longer overview of what we're doing.
Thank you. That was incredibly specific and good, probably because you're the community manager. So CHAOSS is really awesome. It has a lot of people in it, has a lot of projects in it. I know one of those large stakeholders, helpers, collaborators, whatever you want to call them, has been Bitergia, which, Luis, you co-founded. Can you tell me a bit about what Bitergia is, since I'm sure you want to talk about it at least for a few seconds?
Thank you. Well, Bitergia is a small company that some of us created in 2012. Our background was a university group in Madrid. So basically, we were working together. We were analyzing open source software at that time. The research group started when analyzing open source was underground. But in 2012, it wasn't underground anymore, and we started receiving some requests that was more related to something similar to a business. So we decided to avoid going to a boring office and create our own environment, and we decided to create Bitergia by that time. And since then, we have been working with foundations, with open source companies, and with big companies in the IT industry.
And just to add to that, the folks at Bitergia are the primary driver between one of the software tools, which is Grimoire Lab. So they do a lot of the work on the Grimoire Lab toolset. And then we also, I don't remember if Elizabeth mentioned software or not, but we also have another project called Augur. So we do have 2 software projects under the CHAOSS umbrella.
Excellent. So at this point, it's pretty clear these people know what they're doing. Now, what's really nice about that is that you know so much what you're doing in terms of metrics and open source health that you've decided to write it down for other people. And as far as I can tell, this is the impetus behind the practitioner guides, which are new, shiny, and online at the CHAOSS community website. Go to, I guess, chaos.community and then about-chaos-practitioner-guides. There's probably a better link there somewhere on the homepage. I'm seeing 4 main guides that are on the website right now: the introduction, contributor sustainability, responsiveness, and organizational participation. I guess let's start with introduction because that'll lead the way towards what these are and why they're doing what they're doing. Can someone talk to me about what this guide is and how it works, and why would I look at it?
Yeah, I can give you some of the background too, that behind why we created these practitioner guides, because historically, the CHAOSS project, we have a whole bunch of metrics and we have tools or software that help you gather those metrics. And because every open source project is a little bit different, you really have to interpret the metrics in light of your individual situation for your particular project or the set of projects that you're looking at. So there is no one-size-fits-all approach to interpreting metrics. So the way we got around this from the CHAOSS project was we just threw piles of metrics at people and let them interpret them themselves. What we learned over the years is that that really just doesn't work. There are a set of community managers, there are a set of people who really understand how to work with the data, that we're fine with that approach. But if we want to scale the user base of the CHAOSS project itself, we really need to help people interpret their metrics. So these guides were created as a way to give people, you still can't get like this metric means this for all projects. But what the guides do is they help people think about the things that might be going on in their project so that they can use the data to generate meaningful insights that they can then turn into making improvements. And then the introduction guide came about because I started writing one of the guides because that's the best way to figure out kind of what's going to work and what doesn't. So I started writing the responsiveness guide, and there was a whole bunch of stuff in that guide that I was thinking, wow, this probably applies to every guide I'm going to write. So I took a step back and then I created the introduction guide. So the introduction guide is really the fundamental things that you need to think about when you're interpreting metrics for an open source project. So the introduction guide is meant to be read before you read any of the other guides. And it talks about things like the fact that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. It talks about taking a step back and thinking about your goals, and then using your goals for your project or your organization or whatever context you're in as the lens for figuring out which metrics you need to use and how to interpret those. And it talks about things like ethically gathering this data by going out and talking to the people in these communities and in these projects and having them help you interpret the metrics so that you're not just saying things about the project that might not be true or gathering data in a way that the project members are uncomfortable with, which can happen in some open source contexts. The introduction guide is really designed to get you thinking about all of the things that you should be careful about. It has a whole cautions and considerations section, for example, that talks about some things that you might think about. Things like not weaponizing your metrics and using them to punish people or measure people's performance, things like that.
The guide to me looks like it's a PDF. It's a lot of text. It's not a step-by-step walkthrough. It's not a video series. It's not a conference call, 30 minutes free, the next 10 hours build. Can you tell me a bit about what the decision was as to why this format and who and what size open source projects this is really for? Is this for your small NPM project that has like one developer who's looking to build a community? Or is this for the University of Nebraska who has 10,000 people and wants to get them all involved with open source?
So I would say the format ended up starting with the written format because that's the one that I'm most comfortable with, I suppose. It's the one that I tend to prefer. So that's kind of how we started. Plus, I tend to think that it's easier to build on written documents. So I did actually just record a quick video for each of the guides. So those will be posted on the CHAOSS YouTube channel, I think, before this podcast goes live. And we'll link to those videos from each of these documents. But it was really just kind of the easiest way to get this content out there and to get people thinking about it. And then hopefully people will continue to build on it and talk about it in other formats as well.
I also just want to throw in that a written document is also much easier to translate. It's a little more accessible for folks, I think, to have that readily available in a text format.
I think that one of the things that Don mentioned is really key, that we were focusing maybe too much in creating more and more metrics. And I see here a parallel path in CHAOSS and Bitergia. We were adding many metrics and maybe too few insights. So, but it is true that you need to talk to many, many people before you're able to understand what they need to start. And if we are creating CHAOSS and the tools and the reports for data geeks, well, what we have is enough because they are going to play with the tools, they're going to learn the schemas, they're going to go to the details of the data sets. But if we want to scale the user community, we want to provide them something that is more meaningful in less time, because if not, they're going to need a lot of time. So this is why we need this initiative and the format, given the fact that we have AIs and some of them are very cool and useful. I think that starting with written documentation is pretty good because first we create what we think is cool, is useful. And then if it is useful enough, we can also train some models. So people ask directly to a model and we can provide them the metric they need. But as Don will mention, you don't need a single metric because then you are biased.
Yeah. And the other thing that I'll point out about the written format is that these guides all live in an MIT licensed repository, the Data Science Working Group repository, with the idea being that OSPOs or other people could take what we've written, fork them, and maybe customize it for their particular needs as well. So with the idea that people can take these and use them however they'd like, whatever works best for them.
And then I was just going to add one more thing that I think is very different for CHAOSS. As Don mentioned before, we had traditionally just kind of stopped at providing the definitions for the metrics. And so now not only are we helping interpret, we're also providing ideas for improving and moving that needle. And that is something that is a little bit, it's an expansion for CHAOSS really to go into that space of now providing ideas on actually making changes, because that was another limitation of the metrics. Even if you know how to interpret them, well, then what? So we wanted to make them as helpful as possible. And so to Don's point again earlier too, about it being in a repository, I think that's something that CHAOSS really would love is people to contribute to those and help us share ideas on how to move needles and how to make improvements around these metrics.
You mentioned the 2,000 people in the Slack channel, and CHAOSS has obviously been around for more than a few years at this point. Can you tell me about the adoption? Do you already have metrics for like who's using these guides, for instance? I know they've been out for a few weeks. Do you know whether small projects are using it or large projects?
Sadly, no. We really don't know who's using them. A lot of these guides were kind of designed with OSPOs in mind. I think they're useful to anyone who's managing a project, but they were kind of designed for people who are also mentoring other people. So you think about the work that an OSPO does, whether it's a university OSPO or a corporate OSPO, and they tend to be people who help lots of different projects get better. And so with the idea that that's one of the ways that you can kind of scale the sustainability of open source projects is by the people who have the most of them getting involved and making them better.
Thanks a lot for that. I'm sad that it's developed with OSPOs in mind because I wish every single project had its own OSPO, right? I wish every project had infinite resources to work on stuff. And it's true that they don't, right? Not every open source project is going to have a team of 5 people who are dedicated towards figuring things out, which is why I'm also really grateful and happy, the converse of the coin, that you're making these guides to make it easier for people to be able to do this sort of work. You mentioned my favorite word, sustainability, in there, and that's also the name of the second guide. So can you tell me a bit about the Contributor Sustainability Guide and what that focuses on?
One of the things in particular in the Contributor Sustainability Guide is that if you look at the Make Improvements section of it, we tried to make it clear that if you're a small project, if you're just a single maintainer, here are a couple of things that you might want to do to get started when you're looking at making improvements or building community. So I do think that while we designed the guides with OSPOs in mind, I do think that they apply even all the way down to the single maintainer projects, because I think that a single maintainer can pick up a few tips and tricks for things that they might be able to improve, for example. Things like, I think one of the last things in the Contributor Sustainability Guide is talking about having some type of succession plan in place if you're a single maintainer project. And that doesn't necessarily mean having a big team of people, but maybe that means a friend has access to the things that they would need in order to release the project, or a coworker or someone else. And a few of the other things that this focuses on is, so if you're an OSPO and you are looking at a project, talking to the maintainer and asking them where they spend their time, because there are lots of other roles that you can recruit people in to help with your project. You might realize that the maintainer is spending an awful lot of time on things like marketing and community management, which could probably be done a lot more efficiently by someone who is really good at those things and does them professionally. So I think there are a lot of tips in the Contributor Sustainability Guide, I think, that apply whether you're an OSPO or a small project or a big project.
You use this weird term in here, contributor absence factor. Why not just bus factor? Was that what happened?
Naming is hard. I'm just going to say that. Richard knows the history here, so he knows that this is a tough question.
I'm just laughing off camera, by the way. I mean, I'm on mute, but I'm not sorry. Can you talk about this? This is really good. This is great work. I want to hear about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So for a long time, a lot of us have been a little bit uncomfortable with the bus factor as a name for a metric, because ultimately it's how many people need to get hit by a bus for your project to no longer be sustainable. And that really is just some dark thinking there. So I decided that it was time to rename this metric. So I, of course, created an issue in one of the CHAOSS repositories and started suggesting new names. We had a poll. We had 70 some comments on that one issue. And everyone has an opinion about what to name this. We talked about pony factor. We talked about lottery factor. We talked about just about anything you could possibly name this. And we went around for a couple of months before we decided that we were going to stop trying to be clever about the name and just give it a name that describes what it is, just like the rest of the CHAOSS metrics. And so we finally landed on contributor absence factor. And then I very quickly made the pull request and made the change so no one else could disagree with me.
By the way, I lost. I loved bus factor, but I lost. I have to admit that. Well, I'm a minority. Richard, you mentioned something that is very interesting to me. You mentioned the NPM projects, where you usually find one developer doing most of the work. And the question, I think that your question was, what the metrics can do, how the metrics can help these folks. To be honest, I think that what Don said about the tips is very useful. It's something you should start thinking about. But you think about tiny projects where two people are mostly doing all the job, I guess that they are going to know almost everything regarding their project. So metrics are, the bigger the project, the more useful they are. But we have also to think that our project is not only our 10,000 source lines of code. Our project is our lines of code plus the dependencies. And sometimes the dependency tree is so big that the result is multiplied by 10. In that scenario, it is useful to understand the healthy and how the projects you depend on are going.
I think that's a really good point. The guides all they're sort of anchored on maybe 3 or 4 metrics per guide, but we tried to pick metrics that don't necessarily need a lot of data gathering and analysis to figure out. So a lot of these metrics, if you're looking at something like contributor sustainability, you can probably look at GitHub, for example, on the Insights tab, or GitLab, I think, has something similar. And you can see a list of the contributors and how much they've contributed it. You can kind of filter by time. So one of the things that I tried to do with these was not pick super complex metrics that were going to be difficult for people to gather. A lot of these, while they're metrics, you can kind of look at a project and get a feel for the responsiveness. maybe you don't measure it per se, but you can look at the issues and you can look at the pull requests or merge requests, and you can see whether people are generally pretty responsive or not. So I tried to build these around things that weren't going to be so complicated that people couldn't measure them.
I'm trying to think of the appropriate metaphor for what I want to ask, and I can't think of it. But for me, metrics are useful when you want to make incremental changes to a project. They're useful for looking at, oh, okay, we've changed this way, we could change that way. Here's a 5-month plan, a 6-month plan, et cetera. What they don't do is tell you if you're on the wrong road entirely. They don't necessarily give feedback on, well, maybe I should have just not driven the car today at all, and I should have just taken a walk. Can you tell me about how CHAOSS as a whole deals with the idea that your personal position, your power, influence on the project, and your ability to understand metrics may not always be aligned, and maybe there's other things you should do? Like I said, I was trying to think of a better metaphor for how to ask this question, but I'm just doubting whether metrics are always the right thing to use to solve a problem in a project.
I think it just depends on what the project's trying to achieve. So like there are projects that don't care if they're healthy or not, and that they just want to put code out there, and that's totally fine. And maybe they care about how many people are using their software, what completely different things than someone who, and I would really love to see this, by the way, and I've never have, and I really wish if somebody out there has seen this, please tell me, Elizabeth@chaos.community. I would love to see a single maintainer or 2 maintainers start a project with community growth in mind from the very beginning. So like everything they do paves the way for easier community growth later. And I would love to see those type of metrics and that kind of trend. So like setting like documentation from the very start, super easy, very welcoming documentation, very open. So those folks, if they exist, they would care a lot about how many new contributors did we attract to the project right away? How quickly are we releasing things? How responsive are we? So those folks, even though they're a small team, may care about that. So it really just depends on the goals you're trying to achieve with your project as far as which metrics are going to be applicable to you and which you care about. So not everybody's going to care about all the metrics, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
And that, I think, is why it is so important to have these conversations with the people who are driving the project and talk about what matters. Because like you said earlier, Richard, that the metrics don't necessarily tell you whether you're on the right track or not when it comes to making changes. But a lot of times, the people who are working on the project can give you pretty deep insights about what's working and what's not working. And you can back into some of the metrics that way, because you can, if they know that there's a problem with, say, responsiveness, or maybe they know that everyone who participates works for the same organization and there's no organizational diversity within the project. Generally, the people who are intimately involved in the project can point you in the right directions to where you can then dig into the metrics, see what's going on, and then try making some improvements and measure whether or not those are successful and then increment on them.
I want to say that I'm sure that some managers of big ITs want to replace people and staff with metrics, but it doesn't work because we need the experts. So what we can do, as Don mentioned, is that with metrics, we can trace the project. And after doing that, you can talk to the experts and they are going to have more data and they have the knowledge. And with the knowledge they have and with the metrics, the picture is clearer and it is easier to find a diagnosis and to include some changes. But we need the experts and we need them. And we cannot use metrics to replace them.
And to your point earlier, Richard, about how do you know if you're even on the right track at all? We used to get asked this question quite a lot is, can you give me a grade? Well, how do I know if I'm an A project or a B project? And the answer is there just really isn't a good way to do that. If you want to compare your project with others who are similar to yours, I suppose that's a thing you can do if you want to go down that road. But things are so specific to each project. As Don said, there really isn't a right answer. There just isn't. So what might be reasonable for one project just isn't reasonable for another. So there is no like one size fits all, and there is no grading system.
So these guides are useful for figuring out how the metrics can be applied. Elizabeth, going back to your earlier statement of, I would love to see projects that had community growth from the get-go. When I was working for myself as a consultancy called Maintainer Mountaineer, this is what I did, right? So I had hundreds of projects that were from the very beginning. Documentation first, community first, Slack first. even trying to lay out things like all the power is actually with the guy who owns the company and like writing that down somewhere, right? And it sort of works and sort of doesn't work. Earlier, I mentioned this thing called power, right? Which is really, really difficult. A lot of times as a community manager, you don't actually have a lot of power over the project. And what you need is narratives to convince other people that the way you want to change the project is important. You need to be able to shift the rudder of the project as little as you can, often with the big guy in IT who wants to replace you with a metric. So coming back to these guides, do these guides also include helpful tips on how to inform conversations that you have about these metrics with people in positions of power? Do they help you implement them through narrative-based structures as opposed to just saying, here's a metric you can use?
I would say that the guides are focused on helping projects make the improvements that they need to make in the categories that we have for the guides. So that's really the meat of each of the guides, is that I think it's like step 4, which is make improvements, which is in every one of the guides. And it's usually about the biggest section in the whole guide. And that section is chock full of tips and tricks and things you can do within an open source project to help make that project better from within. What the guides don't do is how to communicate what's going on with the project to different audiences, because I feel like that's a very different problem and the communication varies widely by audience, right? So what you say to an engineering manager who manages the people who work on the open source projects is very different from what you would say to a CEO or a board, for example. And I would love for the CHAOSS project to have more of those types of communication guides. We don't yet, but it is something that comes up as a request quite often when we talk about these practitioner guides, is how do we better communicate what's happening and what's going on with the projects.
If only we had some way to sit down and have a conversation and maybe store it in time and maybe distribute it to thousands of people. Oh, wait. Tell me about the other 2 guides we haven't talked about yet, responsiveness and organizational participation. What do these cover?
Yeah, so we can start with responsiveness. So the responsiveness guide looks at a few different ways of looking at responsiveness for our project. So time to first response, which is something that's really important from a newcomer perspective, because if they don't get any kind of response and they've spent a bunch of time making some sort of contribution, then they get discouraged and they go away and they never come back. Time to close is also really important, because if I spent a bunch of time and made a contribution to a project and then it sits around forever and never ever gets merged, again, I'm going to be super disappointed as a contributor. But it also creates technical debt, and there's some other stuff that impacts responsiveness around that as well. And then change request closure ratio, which is around whether you keep up with your pull requests and merge requests, because again, it helps people feel valued. And on the other hand, it also, if you're not keeping up with those, creates a lot of technical debt. Because if you have those old crusty merge requests, they have so many conflicts that they're never going to get merged anyways. You might as well just close those and save yourself some hassle. So that's kind of the purpose around the responsiveness guide, or the metrics that it's focused on. And then the make improvements section, which again is the really important part for each of these, talks about things that you can do to improve responsiveness. And it also provides some cautions. So for example, it sort of starts with attempting to solve responsiveness by putting pressure on the already overworked, burnt out maintainers, and just kind of sticking it to them to respond more quickly is probably not going to help. Putting more pressure on people who are already burnt out and overworked isn't going to help. So it talks about, maybe that's not the underlying problem that's causing this. And then it talks about some different ways to interpret it. For example, things like holidays, big conferences, release schedules. There are lots of things that cause temporary declines in responsiveness that aren't necessarily bad, right? And so you need to talk to the people who are involved in these projects and understand what's going on.
I think this is one of my favorite guides because it's one of the few things that can be too good, I think. So if your responsiveness is almost too quick, then it might signal, are people even paying attention? Or are you just closing things? Or are you just not really considering this conversation, this issue? Or you're just like, nope, not going to fix. So I think that this is one of the areas that really takes a lot of digging, regardless of what your number is and what your trends are. I think that there is a lot of flexibility and a lot of room for things to seem okay and them not to be okay at all.
I like very much this guide, and I would like to mention two user stories that are very different. First one is, let's imagine that you are a community manager and you want to make sure that your community grow in the next 2 years. You really need these metrics. If you don't reply to people in a timely fashion, they are going to get pissed off and they're not going to join the community. And it is likely that you are not going to be successful in your role. So you need to pay the attention they need. You need to make sure that they are heard and also replied. And very different user stories. Let's imagine that you are one of the senior engineers in a big IT. And several years ago, you chose a project and now you are looking for alternatives. So if you start looking for alternatives and you measure the responsiveness of one of them, maybe you see that they are not replying to the issues on time, and they are not being very welcome. They are not being able to close issues as they were closing them 1 year ago. So the trend says that something is not working pretty well in the project. Well, these are very important indicators that something is not working pretty well in the project. Maybe it is something that you can even help to fix, because if you are working in a big corporation, maybe you can invest some time, some money. That means time from your engineers working on the project to improve that situation. But for sure, it shows something that is similar to a red flag that should allow you to make a more informed decision.
Yeah, and some of the other things that are in the make improvement section are not necessarily directly related to responsiveness, but can help a lot with responsiveness over the long term from a scalability perspective. So things that reduce reviewer friction. So things that reduce the friction for the maintainers when it comes to reviewing and responding to pull requests. So things like having issue and pull request or change request templates, good documentation around the contribution process. So providing people with the techniques that they need to make it easier for the maintainers to then do their work, I think also can really help with responsiveness. Because if the maintainers need to spend less time, they're going to be able to respond to more things or respond more quickly.
The MIT license says this is as-is software. And in general, open source software means I'm releasing this into the public and I don't really care if you get back to it. Now, for corporate open source, that isn't true. There's expectations from stakeholders. There's expectations from shareholders, which is probably the worst thing I've ever said on this podcast. Are metrics only for type A corporate people? Or is there something in these guides for people who are just like, yeah, this is my open source project. It's used by 10 million people, but like, I'll get to it when I get to it, man. I'm just curious, like, how do you preach to those people too with these guides?
Well, one of our main customers are foundations. So it depends where you classify them. Foundations are basically the umbrella for many, many different open source projects with big participation from volunteers. So for them, it is quite relevant to show to the community that they are the ones doing the work. So sometimes it is also about showing them or giving them credit about the work they're doing. There are different points of view to use the metrics.
And I think this is why the introduction guide focuses so much on deciding what your goals are for the project. Because like you said, maybe you don't care about responsiveness. Maybe you don't care about contributor sustainability. If something happens to you and the project goes away, whatever. So figure out the things that you care about for your project and work on those, I think is really the message that I would have. What I care about isn't necessarily what you care about.
Hopefully we can all care about open source sustainability together. No, this is great. This is really, really cool. That's a great answer. Both of you should be in the Olympics for jumping over hurdles. Good job. These guides are available online at chaos.community, which is the website for the CHAOSS project. They should be relatively easy to find from there. There's a huge dropdown with lots of cool stuff. Do go check them out. I hope they're useful to people. And the great thing about the CHAOSS community is that these were not made in a back room somewhere in Pasadena by people who wear ties and no faces. They're made by actual people, and you could be one of those people too. So please come join the CHAOSS community working groups. Please come and hang out and contribute. I certainly love going to these calls. They're a lot of fun. And it's good to see your faces again and to hear about this great work. So chaos.community. But don't leave yet, of course. At the end of every show, we have Spotlight. Part of the show where we talk about other people, projects, maintainers, or things, dog toys, whatever, that we feel we just appreciate and would like to have more light shed on. Today, my Spotlight is going to be bird related. This is unsurprising given me. I'm just going to shout out to Johnny Wilson, who is the eBird reviewer for all sorts of countries in Southern Africa, as well as for Tristan da Cunha, Ascension, and St. Helena, 3 islands I review for in the South Atlantic. Johnny and Ian Worley, who I'm sure I've given a spotlight out to before, are just really, really good at helping me figure out what version of white-bellied storm petrel I'm looking at anyway. So just a shout out to Johnny. You're an awesome birder. You probably will never listen to this podcast, although you never know. The open source and birding Venn diagrams are actually fairly close. So great. Elizabeth, I know you are on iNaturalist. What is your spotlight today?
So it was going to be iNaturalist, but I figured that was just too on brand and too predictable. So I chose a project called Clocker. And this has, as a community manager trying to manage 8,000 different time zones, this has absolutely saved my life more than once. It allows you to show more than one time zone on your menu bar at the top of your screen. So right now, for instance, I have San Francisco, Tucson, Chicago, New York, London, Nigeria, Mumbai, Berlin, and China. And those are folks that I deal with in all of those time zones. So now I can, if I need to do a meeting, I can see where everybody is. If I want to ping somebody, I can see exactly what time zone it is for them, or someone near one of those time zones, because I can't keep track of where everybody is. But Clocker, definitely go check that out. If that's something that you deal with on a daily basis, it will be life-changing for you, I hope.
I need to get that. Dawn, what's yours?
So a couple of weeks ago, I was sick and I was not being very productive, and I decided it would be a good time to catch up on my reading. And so I just wanted to thank Nadia Egbal for the work that she has done. So I finished reading Working in Public, The Making and Maintenance of Open Source Software, which is the book. And then I also went back and read the Roads and Bridges paper that she did a few years before that. So the link that I've dropped that'll be in the show notes has both of the book and the paper and links to those. And it's a really accessible way of thinking about open source software and the maintenance and the sustainability of it, using infrastructure as kind of the metaphor. So it's just a really interesting way of looking at the sustainability of open source projects and some of the problems we have and some ways to solve them.
Excellent shout outs. Thank you so much. We've also had her on this podcast. Do go check those out. Luis Cañas-Diaz, what is your spotlight today?
Well, I would like to say thank you to the Moodle community. In case you don't know it, Moodle is a learning platform, and I started reading my first plugin in 2003. Oh, I'm getting old. And I just wanted to say thank you because I learned so much with them. So it was really great to learn a community, being part of the community. And it was the first time I worked with an open source community. So thank you to the Moodle community.
Excellent shout out. Thank you so much, Luis. This was really great. Thank you all for coming onto this podcast and for talking. And thank you, listeners, for listening. Yes, you too play an active role in everything that we do. And there's more things you can do to play a more active role. One, you can like this podcast wherever you're listening to it. If you want to listen to it on a different platform, let me know. I'm the person who could fix that. Also, go to opencollective.com/InsaneOSS if you want to donate to this so that we can continue doing the great work. I'm sure CHAOSS probably has an open collective or something like that too. You can probably donate to them. Spread the love. Why not? Capitalism is great. Besides that, if you have any thoughts, please feel free to email me. So podcast@sustainoss.org or just richard@wordhoardpress.org. All sorts of different emails for me. And I'd be happy to hear any thoughts, complaints, threats, just whatever you want to send. That would be really, really dope. And if you want to talk to any of these great people, you can always join them on the CHAOSS Slack, which I would highly encourage. And those are the main things I wanted to share today. Thank you so much for coming on, Dawn, Liz, and Luis. And good luck with the guides. May they continue to flourish. Thank you to all the other contributors who have also helped out with those guides. Not all of them are listed on the bottom of them. There's amazing people in all the working groups who do a lot of great work. And thanks again.